The bright studio lights blazed down on the political debate stage as former Governor Mike Huckabee stepped forward, his face already flushed with anger. What happened in the next 30 seconds would leave millions of viewers completely speechless and turn a routine political discussion into the most viral moment of the year. The tension in the studio was already thick before the cameras started rolling. Backstage sources later revealed that Huckabee had been pacing in his dressing room, muttering about young politicians who don't know their place. He'd apparently spent weeks preparing what he thought would be devastating attacks against Crockett, confident that his decades of political experience would easily overwhelm someone he viewed as just another inexperienced Congresswoman. "You think you can come here and lecture me about American values?" Huckabee's voice boomed across the studio, his hands trembling with rage as he pointed directly at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The audience fell silent, sensing something explosive was about to unfold. The studio cameras captured every detail, the sweat already beading on Huckabee's forehead, the way his voice cracked slightly on the word values, the shocked expressions on audience members' faces as they realized this wasn't going to be a normal political debate. But what Jasmine Crockett did next, her calm, measured response, would completely destroy Huckabee's argument and leave him standing there frozen, unable to form another word. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was about to become a masterclass in how to handle a bully who thought his years of experience would intimidate a young black congresswoman. The cameras captured every second as Huckabee's confident smirk slowly faded, replaced by something viewers had never seen before, complete and utter defeat at the hands of someone half his age. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss stories like this. The stage was set for political warfare, but nobody, especially Mike Huckabee, was prepared for what Jasmine Crockett had planned. To understand why this confrontation hit so hard, you need to know exactly who these two people are and why their clash represents something much bigger than just a TV debate. Mike Huckabee walked into that studio carrying decades of political weight on his shoulders. As a former Arkansas governor who ran for president twice, he's used to being the most experienced person in any room. For years, he's built his reputation on folksy charm mixed with sharp conservative attacks, always confident that his Southern gentleman persona would give him the upper hand in any debate. Huckabee has spent his career positioning himself as the voice of traditional American values, often using his religious background and small-town roots to connect with conservative audiences. He's appeared on countless political shows, written books, and even hosted his own program. In his mind, he's seen every type of opponent and knows exactly how to handle them. But there was something different about this particular appearance. Sources backstage said Huckabee seemed unusually agitated before the cameras started rolling. Maybe it was because he was facing someone who represented everything his political movement has been fighting against. A young, progressive black woman who refuses to back down from anyone. On the other side of the stage sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing a completely different vision of American politics. At just 42 years old, she's already made waves in Congress with her sharp legal mind and fearless approach to calling out hypocrisy wherever she sees it. Crockett didn't come from political royalty or inherited wealth. She worked her way through law school, built her own practice, and fought for justice in courtrooms across Texas before winning her seat in Congress. Her background as a trial lawyer taught her something crucial: how to stay calm under pressure and use facts as weapons. What makes Crockett particularly dangerous for opponents like Huckabee is her ability to remain perfectly composed while delivering devastating counterattacks. She's not interested in playing the political games that Washington veterans love. Instead, she focuses on results and isn't afraid to call out anyone who tries to intimidate her. This confrontation represented a clash between two Americas, the old guard trying to maintain control and the new generation demanding change. Huckabee came in expecting to use his experience and authority to shut down this young congresswoman, the way powerful men have been doing to women of color for generations. But Crockett had other plans. She'd done her homework, studied Huckabee's record, and came prepared for exactly this type of attack. The question was, would America's viewing audience see through Huckabee's bluster to recognize the substance behind Crockett's calm confidence? The studio audience was split between Huckabee's longtime supporters and Crockett's growing base of young, diverse Americans who are tired of being talked down to by politicians who think age equals wisdom. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. What nobody knew, including Huckabee himself, was that Crockett had uncovered something in her research that would completely flip this entire confrontation on its head. While Huckabee had spent his preparation time crafting emotional appeals and personal attacks, Crockett had been methodically building a fact-based case that would expose the fundamental weakness in his entire political persona. The setup was perfect for political theater: the experienced former governor versus the rising young congresswoman, traditional values versus progressive change, establishment power versus grassroots energy. But beneath the surface, this confrontation represented something much deeper: the collision between old-school political intimidation tactics and new-generation preparation and professionalism. What the audience was about to witness would become a defining moment in modern political discourse. The moderator had barely finished introducing the topic of criminal justice reform when Mike Huckabee launched into his first attack. But what started as standard political sparring quickly spiraled into something much more personal and devastating. "Let me tell you something about criminal justice," Huckabee began, his voice carrying that familiar Arkansas drawl that had charmed audiences for decades. "I've been dealing with these issues since before Congresswoman Crockett here was even thinking about law school." The audience stirred slightly, sensing the condescending tone in his voice. Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands folded, watching Huckabee with the focused attention of a lawyer studying a witness. "We don't need lectures from someone who's been in Congress for 5 minutes about how to keep our communities safe," Huckabee continued, his voice rising. "I was signing legislation and making real decisions while she was still figuring out which law books to read." The camera caught Crockett's slight smile, not defensive or angry, but the kind of expression a chess player gets when their opponent has just walked into a trap. But Huckabee wasn't done. Something about Crockett's calm demeanor seemed to irritate him even more, and he decided to get personal. "You see, this is what's wrong with politics today," he said, pointing directly at Crockett. "We've got people who think a few years in Congress makes them experts on everything. They come from districts where they've never had to face real consequences for their radical ideas." The audience began to murmur. Even Huckabee's supporters seemed uncomfortable with the direction he was taking. "Congresswoman Crockett represents everything that's wrong with the Democratic Party," Huckabee pressed on, his face getting redder with each word. "She's more interested in making headlines than making real change. She's more focused on Twitter battles than actual legislation." Crockett remained perfectly composed, occasionally nodding as if she were taking notes on Huckabee's performance. Her calm was clearly bothering him more than any angry response would have. Then came the moment that would define the entire confrontation. The moderator tried to give Crockett a chance to respond, but Huckabee wasn't finished. No, he interrupted, his voice now shaking with anger. "I'm not done talking. This is exactly the problem. These young politicians think they can just interrupt and take over whenever they want." He stood up from his chair, towering over the seated Crockett, his hands visibly trembling as he pointed at her. "You think you can come here and lecture me about American values?" Huckabee yelled, his voice echoing through the studio. "I've been serving this country since you were in diapers. I've made real decisions that affected real people while you were playing dress-up in mock trial." The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed stunned by the sudden explosion of anger from the usually controlled Huckabee. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing a complete meltdown or a calculated political attack. The split in the audience became immediately visible. Huckabee's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats, many of them looking embarrassed by their champion's loss of control. Some whispered to each other, clearly questioning whether this was the behavior they wanted from their political leaders. Meanwhile, Crockett's supporters sat forward in their chairs, waiting to see how she would handle this unprecedented attack. Many of them had seen powerful men try to intimidate strong women before, and they were eager to see if Crockett would crumble under the pressure or rise to the occasion. The moderator tried desperately to regain control of the situation, but Huckabee was beyond listening to anyone else in the room. His entire focus was on trying to overwhelm Crockett with the force of his anger and experience. "Don't you sit there." "Looking so calm and collected," Huckabee continued, his voice now bordering on a scream. "You're representing some of the most dangerous districts in America, places where your soft-on-crime policies have let criminals run wild in the streets." He began pacing behind his chair, gesturing wildly as he spoke. "I've seen what happens when politicians like you get their way. Chaos, violence, families torn apart because somebody thought being progressive was more important than being practical." The cameras captured every moment of Huckabee's meltdown, from the sweat beading on his forehead to the way his hands shook as he gripped the back of his chair. It was clear that something had pushed him far beyond his usual political persona. What the audience couldn't see was the preparation that had led to this moment. In the green room before the show, Crockett had reviewed her notes one final time. She'd spent weeks researching not just Huckabee's political positions, but his personal history, his business dealings, and his record as governor. While Huckabee had come into the studio expecting to face another young politician who would wilt under pressure, Crockett had come prepared for war. She'd anticipated exactly this type of attack and had her response ready. As Huckabee continued his tirade, Crockett reached calmly into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The cameras caught the movement, and suddenly the entire atmosphere in the studio shifted. Even Huckabee seemed to sense that something was about to change. "Are you even listening to me?" Huckabee demanded, finally noticing that Crockett was looking at the paper instead of responding to his attacks. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. No respect, no attention to the people who came before you." Crockett looked up slowly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she spoke. "Oh, I'm listening, Governor," she said, her voice so calm and controlled that it seemed to suck all the energy out of Huckabee's anger. "I'm listening very carefully, and I think our viewers deserve to hear some facts before we continue." The paper in her hand seemed to glow under the studio lights, and suddenly, everyone, including Huckabee, realized that this young Congresswoman had been playing a completely different game all along. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media and talked about in political circles for years to come. Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver one of the most devastating political counterattacks ever captured on live television. Crockett stood up slowly, the paper still in her hand, her movements deliberate and controlled. The contrast with Huckabee's frantic pacing couldn't have been more stark. Where he was all motion and emotion, she was stillness and steel. "Governor." "Huckabee," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent studio. "You've spent the last several minutes trying to lecture me about criminal justice and public safety. You've questioned my experience, my district, and my qualifications." Huckabee tried to interrupt, but something in Crockett's tone made him pause. For the first time since his explosion began, he seemed uncertain. "But before we continue," Crockett said, holding up the paper, "I think our viewers deserve to know about your own record on these issues. This document," Crockett continued, "shows the crime statistics from Arkansas during your tenure as governor. Would you like me to read them?" Huckabee's face went pale. That's taken out of context," he stammered. "Really?" Crockett's eyebrows rose slightly. "Because according to the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting data, violent crime in Arkansas increased by 23% during your time in office. Property crime went up by 31%. These aren't my numbers, Governor. These are federal statistics." The audience began to murmur as the reality of what was happening started to sink in. Huckabee had spent months preparing attacks about crime and safety, never expecting that someone would actually check his own record. That's not fair," Huckabee protested weakly. There were economic factors, demographic changes. Oh, I agree completely, Crockett said with devastating calm. There are always factors that contribute to crime rates, which is exactly why your simplistic attacks on my district and my policies show such a fundamental misunderstanding of how public safety actually works. But Crockett wasn't finished. She flipped to another page in her folder. Since you mentioned my district specifically, she continued, let's talk about results. In my first 2 years in Congress, I've helped bring $47 million in federal funding for community policing initiatives to my area. Crime in my district has dropped by 12% since I took office. The camera caught Huckabee's mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He'd come prepared to attack, but he'd never prepared to defend his own record. Furthermore, Crockett pressed on. During your time as governor, Arkansas had one of the highest recidivism rates in the nation. Your tough-on-crime approach resulted in people being released from prison and immediately reoffending at rates that were significantly higher than the national average. Each fact hit Huckabee like a physical blow. The man who had entered the studio so confident in his experience and authority was now standing there completely defenseless against an opponent who had done something he never expected. Actual research. Now, Governor, Crockett said, her voice never rising above conversational level. You mentioned that I come from a district where I've never faced real consequences for my ideas. But let me ask you something. What consequences did you face when your policies failed the people of Arkansas? Huckabee tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The complete role reversal was stunning to watch. The man who had been screaming and pointing just minutes earlier was now frozen in place. Because from what I can see, Crockett continued, consulting another page, when crime rates went up in Arkansas, when recidivism rates remained high, when your criminal justice policies failed, you didn't face any consequences at all. You left office, started a media career, and began giving lectures to other people about how to fight crime. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Everyone was waiting to see how Huckabee would respond to this systematic destruction of his credibility. But Crockett still wasn't done. You know what, Governor? She said, finally allowing a slight edge to enter her voice. You're absolutely right about one thing. Experience matters. And my experience as a trial lawyer taught me to always check the facts before making accusations. She held up the papers one more time. Your experience as a politician taught you to make loud accusations and hope nobody would bother to verify them. Well, I bothered to verify them, and the results speak for themselves. Huckabee opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For perhaps the first time in his decades-long political career, Mike Huckabee was completely speechless. The reaction in the studio was immediate and dramatic. Crockett's supporters were on their feet applauding, not just for her response, but for the way she had systematically dismantled every one of Huckabee's attacks using nothing but facts and logic. Even some of Huckabee's supporters seemed stunned by what they had witnessed. Several were shaking their heads, clearly disappointed that their champion had been so thoroughly outmatched. Others were whispering among themselves, probably questioning whether the man they had supported for years had ever bothered to check his own facts. The moderator tried to regain control of the situation, but it was clear that the debate was effectively over. Huckabee stood there, his earlier anger completely deflated, looking like a man who had just realized he'd brought a stick to a gunfight. As the camera zoomed in for a close-up, viewers could see exactly what had happened to Mike Huckabee. The confident, experienced politician who had entered the studio was gone, replaced by someone who looked confused, embarrassed, and completely out of his depth. Crockett, meanwhile, sat back down with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. She placed her papers neatly back in her folder and folded her hands, waiting to see if Huckabee had anything else to say. He didn't. The man who had started the evening by yelling about respect and experience ended it in complete silence, unable to mount even the weakest defense of his own record. As the show cut to commercial break, the cameras caught one final moment that would become iconic in political circles. Crockett remained in her seat, calm and professional, while Huckabee slowly walked off the set without saying another word to anyone. The contrast was perfect. The young Congresswoman who had been attacked for her inexperience had just given a masterclass in preparation and professionalism, while the veteran politician who had boasted about his decades of experience had revealed himself to be nothing more than hot air and empty rhetoric. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were already starting to spread across social media. The hashtag #CrockettFacts began trending, and political commentators were calling it one of the most one-sided political destructions they had ever witnessed. But this was just the beginning of the fallout that would reshape both of their careers, in ways neither could have imagined. The lights in the studio had barely dimmed before the political earthquake that Jasmine Crockett had just unleashed began rippling across the entire American political landscape. What had started as Mike Huckabee's attempt to intimidate a young congresswoman had turned into a career-defining moment that would reshape how both politicians were viewed for years to come. Within 30 minutes of the show ending, #CrockettFacts was trending nationwide on every major social media platform. The clip of Huckabee yelling while Crockett sat calmly had been viewed over 100,000 times before most people had even gotten home from work. The most shared clip wasn't even the moment when Crockett revealed Huckabee's crime statistics. It was the split-screen shot of Huckabee's red, angry face next to Crockett's calm, professional expression as she methodically destroyed his arguments with facts. Political Twitter exploded with reactions from across the spectrum. Progressive accounts were celebrating with posts like, "This is how you handle a bully," with facts, and Crockett just gave a masterclass in staying calm while destroying bad faith arguments. But even some conservative commentators had to admit that Huckabee had been thoroughly outmatched. One prominent Republican strategist tweeted, "Regardless of your politics, you have to respect preparation and professionalism." Huckabee got schooled tonight. The visual of Huckabee frozen in silence while Crockett sat calmly with her papers became instant meme material. Images started flooding social media with captions like, "When you come to argue with feelings, but she brings receipts," and "the moment you realize she actually did her homework." One particularly viral meme showed side-by-side photos. Huckabee mid-yell with the caption, "How men think they win arguments," next to Crockett with her papers captioned, "How women actually win arguments." The post was shared over 50,000 times in its first hour online. Young people especially connected with the imagery of a composed black woman using facts and preparation to defeat an older white man who had tried to intimidate her with volume and authority. It represented something they had been waiting to see in politics: competence defeating bluster, preparation defeating privilege. Political analysts across the spectrum were forced to grapple with what they had witnessed. The confrontation had been so one-sided that even partisan commentators struggled to spin it in Huckabee's favor. A veteran political reporter wrote, "In 30 years of covering politics, I've rarely seen such a complete destruction of a politician's credibility in real time." Huckabee came prepared for a shouting match and found himself in a doctoral defense. Liberal commentators were more direct in their praise. Jasmine Crockett just showed every young woman in America how to handle workplace bullying. Stay calm, do your homework, and let the facts speak for themselves. But perhaps most damaging for Huckabee were the reactions from conservative media figures who had previously supported him. One wrote, "Mike Huckabee embarrassed himself in our movement tonight. You cannot claim to be the party of facts and then get demolished by facts on national television." The revelation about Arkansas crime statistics during Huckabee's tenure sent political reporters scrambling to verify Crockett's numbers. What they found was even more damaging. Not only were her statistics accurate, but they had been publicly available for years. Local Arkansas newspapers began running stories about how their former governor's tough-on-crime reputation had been built more on rhetoric than results. Former Arkansas state legislators started speaking on the record about policies they had privately questioned during Huckabee's time in office. "We always wondered why Mike talked so tough about crime when our numbers weren't improving," one former Arkansas state senator said. "But nobody wanted to challenge him publicly because he was so popular with the base." The fact that Crockett had found these statistics so easily raised uncomfortable questions about why political journalists hadn't fact-checked Huckabee's crime claims over the years. Several media outlets published soul-searching pieces about their failure to hold politicians accountable for their records. For Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation marked a turning point in her national political profile. Requests for interviews began pouring in from major news networks. Political organizations started reaching out about speaking engagements, but more importantly, other politicians began taking notice of her approach. Several fellow Congresswomen publicly praised her handling of the situation, with one writing, "This is how it's done. Preparation, professionalism, and precision. Every woman in politics should study this masterclass." Democratic Party fundraising emails began featuring clips from the debate, using Crockett's performance as an example of the new generation of leadership the party needed. Small dollar donations to her campaign committee tripled in the week following. The confrontation. Young political science students started analyzing the debate in their classes, studying how Crockett had turned Huckabee's aggression against him by remaining calm and letting his behavior speak for itself. For Mike Huckabee, the aftermath was far more challenging. The man who had built his political brand on folksy wisdom and moral authority found himself the subject of uncomfortable questions about both his competence and his character. Conservative donors who had previously supported him began privately, questioning whether he was still an effective spokesperson for their causes. Several speaking engagements were quietly canceled, with event organizers citing scheduling conflicts. More damaging were the questions about his preparation and research methods. If he had been so wrong about his own record, how could anyone trust his analysis of other political issues? Former staff members began speaking anonymously to reporters about Huckabee's work habits, with several describing him as someone who relied more on instinct and charisma than careful policy analysis. Mike always believed his charm could carry him through any situation, one former aide said. But charm doesn't work when someone shows up with a folder full of facts. The confrontation began to be cited as evidence of a broader shift in American politics, away from personality-driven politics toward competence-based evaluation of leaders. Political science professors started using the debate as a teaching tool, showing students how preparation and factual accuracy could be more powerful than traditional political theater. Women's leadership organizations began featuring Crockett in their materials as an example of how to handle workplace intimidation and sexism. Her calm, fact-based response became a template that was taught in corporate training sessions across the country. In the months following the debate, both politicians saw their careers move in dramatically different directions. Crockett found herself increasingly mentioned as a rising star in national Democratic politics, with some suggesting she could be presidential material in the future. Huckabee, meanwhile, found his influence within conservative circles significantly diminished. His social media following began to plateau, and his appearances on political shows became less frequent. The contrast highlighted a changing dynamic in American politics. Voters, especially younger ones, were becoming less impressed by experience and authority alone, and more focused on actual results and competence. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the confrontation was its value as a teaching moment for young people, especially women and people of color, who face intimidation in professional settings. Crockett's approach, staying calm, doing thorough research, and letting facts speak for themselves, became a model that was taught in law schools, business schools, and leadership development programs across the country. The debate clips were used in workshops on handling workplace bullying, with participants analyzing how Crockett maintained her composure while systematically dismantling her opponent's credibility. Looking back on the confrontation, political historians would likely mark it as a pivotal moment in the evolution of American political discourse. It showed that in an era of social media and instant fact-checking, politicians could no longer rely solely on bluster and authority to win arguments. Crockett's performance demonstrated that the new generation of political leaders was fundamentally different from their predecessors, more prepared, more professional, and more willing to use actual data to support their positions. For viewers who watched the debate live, It was a reminder that political confrontations don't always have to be shouting matches. Sometimes, the most powerful response to aggression is calm professionalism backed by thorough preparation. The image of Jasmine Crockett, sitting calmly with her folder of facts, while Mike Huckabee stood frozen in silence, became an iconic representation of this new approach to political leadership, one that values competence over charisma, preparation over personality, and facts over feelings. As the dust settled from this historic confrontation, one thing became clear. American politics was changing, and politicians who failed to adapt to this new reality would find themselves left behind. Just like Mike Huckabee found himself that night, standing in stunned silence while a better prepared opponent calmly dismantled everything he thought he knew about winning political arguments. The question now was whether other politicians would learn from Crockett's example and elevate the quality of political discourse, or whether they would continue to rely on the old playbook that had failed Huckabee so spectacularly. Thanks for watching this incredible political showdown between Jasmine Crockett and Mike Huckabee. If you enjoyed seeing how preparation and professionalism can triumph over bluster and intimidation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss moments like these. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Crockett's masterful handling of this situation, and what other political confrontations you'd like us to analyze next. The world of politics is full of dramatic moments like this one, and we'll be here to break them all down for you.